What really happened to Atlantis? Boring history. Good evening. Tonight we're going to talk about a city that never was. A civilization that exists only in words written over 2,000 years ago. A place that has consumed more ink, more debate, and more human imagination than perhaps any other lost city in history. And yet, for all the searching, all the theories, all the underwater expeditions and sonar scans and desperate hopes, we have never found a single stone. Not one artifact. Not a shard of pottery or a foundation or a coin. We're going to talk about Atlantis, but we're going to do it quietly, without drama, without the breathless promise of discovery or the thrill of conspiracy. Because the story of Atlantis is not actually a story about a lost continent at all. It is a story about us, about what we want to believe, about how legends are born from a handful of pages and grow into something that reshapes how we see the past. So settle in, let the day fade, and let's begin with the only place Atlantis has ever truly existed, in the mind of one man, in ancient Greece, over 2 millennia ago. The single source. If you were to ask 100 people where the story of Atlantis comes from, many would tell you it's an ancient legend, passed down through countless cultures, whispered from generation to generation. They might imagine Egyptian priests telling the tale, or sailors returning from distant voyages, or tablets recovered from buried temples. But here is the truth, quiet and unadorned. Almost everything we know about Atlantis comes from just one person. His name was Plato. He was a philosopher who lived in Athens from approximately 427 to 347 BCE. And in two of his dialogues, written around 360 BCE, he introduced the world to Atlantis. That's it. One author. 2 texts. A few thousand words. The texts are called Timaeus and Critias. They are philosophical dialogues, a form Plato perfected, where characters engage in conversations exploring ideas about justice, knowledge, and the nature of reality. In these particular works, the main narrative device is a story supposedly passed down through generations. A character named Critias claims that his great-grandfather heard it from Solon, a famous Athenian lawmaker who had traveled to Egypt around 600 BC. According to this retelling, Egyptian priests in the city of Sais told Solon about a great conflict that occurred 9,000 years before their conversation. The story goes like this. There was once a powerful island nation called Atlantis, located beyond the Pillars of Hercules. That's what the ancient Greeks called the Strait of Gibraltar, the narrow passage between the Mediterranean Sea and the Atlantic Ocean. This island, according to Plato's account, was larger than Libya and Asia Minor combined. It was ruled by kings who were descendants of the god Poseidon. The Atlanteans had built a magnificent civilization with elaborate architecture, advanced engineering, and formidable military power. For generations, the people of Atlantis were noble and virtuous. But over time, their divine nature faded. They became corrupt. They grew greedy. They began to hunger for conquest. And so they set out to enslave the peoples of the Mediterranean, including the Greeks. It was ancient Athens, according to the tale, that stood against this imperial aggression. Despite being vastly outnumbered, the Athenians defeated the Atlantean forces. But the story doesn't end with victory. Shortly after the war, catastrophe struck. Violent earthquakes shook the earth. The sea rose. And in a single day and night, both the Athenian army and the entire island of Atlantis vanished. The army was swallowed by the earth. The island sank beneath the waves, leaving behind only impassable mud that made the waters unnavigable. That is the story. Dramatic, complete, and for over 2,000 years, people have been trying to decide what it means. The philosopher's intentions. To understand Atlantis, we have to understand something about Plato and the world he inhabited. He was not a historian. He was not writing chronicles of past events. He was a philosopher engaged in a lifelong project of exploring how societies should be organized, how people should live, and what constitutes justice and virtue. Plato lived through turbulent times. Athens had just lost the devastating Peloponnesian War against Sparta. The democracy that had once made Athens great was struggling. Plato had seen his beloved teacher Socrates executed by the democratic government for allegedly corrupting the youth and disrespecting the gods. These experiences shaped his thinking deeply. In his most famous work, The Republic, Plato describes an ideal society, Callipolis, ruled by philosopher kings who would govern with wisdom rather than personal ambition. It's a society built on rigid class structures, where everyone has a designated role, and where the pursuit of wealth and power is subordinated to the pursuit of truth and virtue. The Timaeus and Critias dialogues were meant to continue this philosophical project. At the beginning of Timaeus, Socrates, who serves as Plato's mouthpiece in many dialogues, expresses a desire to see his ideal city in action, not just described in theory but engaged in real conflicts and challenges. In response, Critias offers to tell the story of Atlantis, specifically because it shows ancient Athens, which he claims resembled Plato's ideal city, in conflict with a great imperial power. Think about that structure for a moment. The entire Atlantis narrative is introduced as a way to illustrate philosophical ideas about governance. It's a story designed to show an ideal society tested by war against a corrupt one. This is why most scholars today believe Atlantis was what philosophers call an allegory, a story whose surface narrative is less important than the ideas it conveys. The Athens in Plato's story represents his vision of a just society, disciplined, virtuous, focused on the common good. Atlantis represents the opposite, a society that began with divine gifts and natural advantages but fell into moral decay through materialism, imperialism, and hubris. The message seems clear. Even the most powerful civilization will fall if it loses its moral foundation. The gods, in Plato's telling, destroyed Atlantis not because it was weak but because it had become arrogant and unjust. This mirrors themes Plato explored throughout his work, particularly his warnings about how democracies could degenerate into tyrannies, and how the pursuit of wealth and power corrupts both individuals and states. There's another layer to consider. Some scholars suggest Plato may have been offering a critique of his own Athens. The imperial ambitions of Athens during its glory days, its maritime empire, its eventual defeat and humiliation, these might have echoed uncomfortably with the story of Atlantis. By setting the tale in the distant past, Plato could explore these themes without directly criticizing his contemporaries. Even in ancient times, people recognized this. Aristotle, Plato's own student, apparently did not believe Atlantis was a real place. He understood it as a literary device his teacher had created to make philosophical points. The story was meant to make you think, not to send you searching the seas. But human nature is curious, and the idea of a lost civilization, advanced and beautiful, swallowed by the ocean in a single catastrophic moment, that's the kind of story that doesn't just illustrate a point. It takes on a life of its own. When stories become searches. For many centuries after Plato died, Atlantis remained what it had always been, a story in a book. It was discussed by philosophers, mentioned occasionally by other writers, but generally understood as allegorical. The world moved on. Empires rose and fell. Libraries burned. Knowledge was lost and rediscovered, But in the late 19th century, something changed. The story of Atlantis was reborn, and this time, people began to believe it was real. The transformation began with a man named Ignatius Donnelly. He was an American congressman from Minnesota, a populist politician with a passion for amateur scholarship. In 1882, Donnelly published a book called Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. In it, he argued that Atlantis had truly existed, that it was the original civilization from which all others sprang, that its refugees had spread across the globe after the catastrophe, bringing knowledge of agriculture, architecture, and writing to primitive peoples who could never have developed such advances on their own. Donnelly's book was a sensation. It went through numerous editions and translations. It inspired countless imitators and believers, but it was also built on a foundation of misunderstandings, selective evidence, and assumptions that modern science has thoroughly dismantled. Donnelly believed, for instance, that the Atlantic Ocean floor was much shallower than it actually is. He thought a large landmass could have existed where Plato said it did and then sunk due to geological changes. But modern oceanography has mapped the ocean floor extensively using sonar, satellites, and deep-sea exploration. We know the shape of every major underwater mountain range and trench. There is no sunken continent in the Atlantic. The floor is, in fact, spreading apart due to tectonic activity, not sinking or rising in ways that could have swallowed a landmass in human history. Donnelly also promoted something called diffusionism, the idea that all advanced civilizations must have borrowed their knowledge from a single source rather than developing independently. This idea is no longer accepted by archaeologists and anthropologists. We now have extensive evidence that human cultures around the world independently invented agriculture, writing, architecture, and other technologies. The ancient Egyptians, Mesopotamians, Chinese, and Mesoamericans all developed complex civilizations without needing instruction from a mythical Atlantis. But Donnelly's book arrived at a time when people were fascinated by archaeology and ancient history. The 19th century saw spectacular discoveries. Egyptian tombs opened for the first time in millennia, cuneiform tablets from Mesopotamia translated, the ruins of Troy uncovered by Heinrich Schliemann. If all these legendary places were real, people reasoned, why not Atlantis? Others followed Donnelly's lead, adding their own layers to the myth. Madame Helena Blavatsky, a Russian mystic and founder of the Theosophical Society, incorporated Atlantis into her spiritual teachings in the 1880s, claiming its people were part of a root race with psychic powers. Edgar Cayce, an American psychic in the early 20th century, gave thousands of readings in which he claimed people had past lives in Atlantis. He predicted the continent would rise again in 1969. It did not. Each retelling added something new. The Atlantis of popular imagination became a place of crystal power sources, advanced technology beyond even our own, spiritual wisdom, and ancient astronauts. It became disconnected from Plato's relatively simple tale of a war and a catastrophe. It became whatever people wanted it to be. And that tells us something important. The endurance of the Atlantis myth is not about evidence. It's about desire. The desire to believe in a golden age, a time when people were wiser, more advanced, more harmonious with nature. The desire to believe that our own civilization's struggles and failures are not unique, that even the greatest societies can fall. And perhaps, most poignantly, the desire to believe that beneath the ocean, hidden from our view, there are still mysteries waiting to be discovered. The absence of evidence. Let's talk about what we haven't found. Archaeology is, at its core, the study of what people leave behind. civilizations leave traces. They leave buildings, roads, pottery, tools, trash, bones, artwork, and writing. Even when cities are destroyed, even when they're buried under volcanic ash or flooded by rising seas or eroded by centuries of wind and rain, they leave something. We've found the remains of settlements that are over 9,000 years old. Çatalhöyük in modern Turkey was occupied from approximately 7500 to 5800 BCE. Jericho has evidence of habitation going back 11,000 years. These were not advanced civilizations by our standards, simple agricultural communities mostly, but they left behind foundations, walls, hearths, and tools. We can trace the development of human society from small hunter-gatherer camps to the first permanent villages to the rise of cities and states. If Atlantis existed as Plato described it, a civilization that ruled a vast empire, that built magnificent structures, that had the engineering capability to create elaborate harbors and canals, then where are its traces? The Atlantic Ocean has been extensively mapped. Modern technology allows us to create detailed three-dimensional models of the seafloor. We can identify underwater mountains, ridges, valleys, and plateaus. We've found shipwrecks from thousands of years ago. We've discovered underwater volcanic vents and unusual geological formations. But nowhere in the Atlantic is there evidence of a sunken continent or even a large island that disappeared in the time frame Plato describes. Some have suggested that Atlantis lies in areas that haven't been fully explored yet. But the scale matters. Plato said Atlantis was larger than Libya and Asia Minor combined. That's not a small island. It would be a landmass comparable to several million square kilometers. You cannot hide something that large, even at the bottom of the ocean. There's also the question of geological plausibility. Could a landmass that size sink in a day and a night? The answer, according to geologists, is no. The processes that cause land to rise or subside operate on timescales of thousands or millions of years. Tectonic plates move at roughly the speed your fingernails grow. Islands can be destroyed by volcanic eruptions, and coastal areas can be flooded by tsunamis or rising sea levels, but an entire continent cannot simply vanish overnight. There's one more telling absence. Nobody else wrote about it. Plato's account is the only ancient source that mentions Atlantis by that name and describes it in detail. The Egyptians who supposedly told Solon the story left no records of it in their extensive historical texts. The Greeks themselves, aside from a few later writers who referenced Plato's work, didn't pass down independent traditions about Atlantis. There are no Phoenician accounts, no Babylonian tablets, no Chinese chronicles mentioning a vast Atlantic empire. This silence is significant. When major events occur, when empires fall, when catastrophes reshape the landscape, people talk about it. They write it down. They tell stories. The fact that no one besides Plato mentioned Atlantis suggests strongly that it was his invention, not a memory of real events passed down through the ages. Archaeologists often talk about the difference between absence of evidence and evidence of absence. Sometimes we simply haven't looked in the right place yet. But there comes a point where the lack of evidence, despite extensive searching, becomes evidence itself. After over a century of oceanography, marine geology, and underwater archaeology, after countless expeditions and theories and investigations, we have found nothing. At some point, we have to acknowledge what that means. The real lost civilization. But here's where the story becomes more interesting. Because while Atlantis itself is fiction, the idea of civilizations destroyed by catastrophe is not. History is full of real societies that fell suddenly, that were buried or submerged or abandoned, leaving only ruins for us to puzzle over. And one of these real civilizations bears a striking resemblance to Plato's Atlantis. Not a perfect match, but close enough that many scholars believe it might have inspired the tale. This was the Minoan civilization on the island of Crete and the nearby volcanic island of Thera, which we now call Santorini. The Minoans flourished during the Bronze Age, roughly from 3000 to 1500 BC. They built elaborate palace complexes at sites like Knossos and Phaistos. They developed an early form of writing called Linear A, which we still haven't fully deciphered. They created sophisticated art, plumbing systems, and architectural designs. They were skilled sailors and traders whose influence spread throughout the Aegean Sea. On the island of Thera, about 70 miles north of Crete, the Minoans established a prosperous settlement called Akrotiri. It was a beautiful place, judging from the ruins. Multi-story buildings with colorful frescoes. Streets paved with stones. Pottery and jewelry and evidence of a cultured, affluent society. But Thera was a volcano, and around 1600 BCE, it erupted. The eruption was catastrophic. It was one of the largest volcanic events in recorded human history, comparable to the famous eruption of Krakatoa in 1883. The volcano blasted roughly 10 million tons of rock, ash, and gas into the atmosphere. The force was so great that much of the island collapsed into the sea, forming the distinctive crescent shape and submerged caldera that visitors to Santorini see today. The eruption would have generated massive tsunamis. We found evidence of these waves in layers of sediment along the north coast of Crete. Coastal settlements were inundated. Buildings were destroyed. The layer of volcanic ash that fell across the region would have smothered crops and poisoned water supplies for years afterward. Did this eruption destroy the Minoan civilization? It's not quite that simple. For many years, archaeologists believed there was a direct link: volcano erupts, Minoans collapse. But more recent evidence complicates the picture. Radiocarbon dating and analysis of ice cores from Greenland suggest the eruption might have occurred around 1645 BC. Meanwhile, the decline of Minoan culture seems to have happened later, around 1500 to 1400 BCE, when the palaces on Crete were destroyed, possibly by invasion from mainland Greece. So the timing doesn't quite match. The Minoans didn't disappear immediately after the eruption, but the disaster likely weakened them significantly. Imagine losing many of your coastal cities, your trade routes disrupted, your agricultural base damaged. Even if the civilization limped along for another century or two, the eruption could have been the beginning of the end, making them vulnerable to invasions and internal instability. Now think about Plato's story. A powerful maritime civilization. An island in the sea. A catastrophic destruction involving earthquakes and floods. The civilization sinking beneath the waves in a single day and night. The parallels are intriguing. Could Plato, or the sources he drew upon, have known something about the Minoan civilization and the Thera eruption? It's possible. The Bronze Age was not completely forgotten in ancient Greece. Homer's epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, preserve memories of the Mycenaean Greeks who came after the Minoans. Stories and fragments of stories can survive for a very long time. But there are problems with equating Atlantis directly with the Minoans. First, the timeline is off. Plato says Atlantis existed 9,000 years before Solon, which would place it around 9600 BC, far earlier than any Bronze Age civilization. Some have suggested this was a mistake in translation, that Egyptian priests might have been counting lunar months instead of solar years, but this requires assuming an error that conveniently makes the story fit. Second, the geography doesn't match. Plato explicitly places Atlantis beyond the Pillars of Hercules in the Atlantic Ocean. Crete and Santorini are in the Aegean Sea, well within the Mediterranean. You have to change or ignore Plato's own words to make the connection work. Third, the size is wrong. Plato says Atlantis was larger than Libya and Asia Minor combined. Crete is a large island, but not that large. Santorini before the eruption was even smaller. So while the Minoan-Thera connection is fascinating, and while it's entirely possible that stories about the eruption influenced later Greek legends, we can't say definitively that Atlantis equals the Minoans. At best, the Thera catastrophe might have provided a template, a memory of how civilizations can fall suddenly, that Plato incorporated into his philosophical parable. Sunken cities we have found. The search for Atlantis has been frustrating because we're looking for something that likely never existed. But that doesn't mean the oceans haven't swallowed real cities. They have. And studying these genuine submerged settlements tells us something important about how coastlines change and how sea levels rise. Consider the city of Pavlopetri off the southern coast of Greece. Discovered in 1967, it lies about 3 to 4 meters underwater. Archaeological surveys have revealed streets, buildings, courtyards, and tombs dating back about 5,000 years to the Bronze Age. It's not as grand as the mythical Atlantis, but it is a real city that was submerged, most likely due to a series of earthquakes that caused the land to sink. Or look at Thonis Heracleion in Egypt. This was a major port city at the mouth of the Nile, mentioned by ancient historians like Herodotus. For centuries, it was lost, swallowed by the Mediterranean. Then in the year 2000, underwater archaeologist Frank Gaudio and his team discovered its ruins. They found massive statues, including 15-foot-tall figures of Ptolemaic rulers. They found anchors, gold coins, jewelry, and inscribed tablets. They found the remains of the Temple of Ammonius and evidence of the city's role in Egypt's trade networks. Why did Thonis Heracleion sink? It appears that the land beneath the city slowly subsided over many centuries, a process called Brachysism. The Nile Delta is geologically unstable. Earthquakes likely contributed, and so, gradually, the Mediterranean claimed the city. Not in a single day and night, but slowly, inexorably, until it was gone. Then there's Atlit Yam off the coast of Israel, a Neolithic village that dates back about 9,000 years. It was occupied when sea levels were much lower, before the end of the last ice age. As the climate warmed and glaciers melted, the oceans rose. Coastal settlements were gradually flooded. Atlit Yam now sits nearly 10 meters underwater. Archaeologists have found stone houses, wells, stone circles, and even human skeletons still preserved in the sediment. These sunken cities are important because they remind us that sea levels are not constant. At the end of the last ice age, roughly 12,000 years ago, sea levels were more than 100 meters lower than they are today. Vast areas that are now ocean floor were dry land. People lived there, hunted there, built communities there. As the ice melted, the water rose. It happened slowly by human standards, but inexorably. Over thousands of years, enormous stretches of coastline were submerged. This process created real lost lands. Doggerland, for instance, was a landmass that connected Britain to continental Europe during the Ice Age. As sea levels rose, it became an island, and then gradually disappeared beneath the North Sea. We've found stone tools and bones from the people who lived there, dredged up by fishing nets. So Plato's story of a land swallowed by the sea resonates because it touches on something true. Coasts change. Islands vanish. Cities are claimed by rising waters. But these processes take centuries or millennia, not a single day and night. And they leave evidence behind, ruins and artifacts that tell us what was lost. The difference with Atlantis is simple: we have found no such evidence. No ruins, no artifacts, no geological traces of the landmass Plato described. The absence is comprehensive, and after decades of searching, that absence tells us something. Why we keep looking? If the evidence is so clear, if archaeologists and geologists are nearly unanimous that Atlantis never existed, why does the search continue? Why do books and documentaries and websites keep claiming that Atlantis is just around the corner, waiting to be found? Part of it is simple human nature. We love mysteries. We love the idea that there are still secrets hidden in the world, that despite all our technology and all our knowledge, something extraordinary remains undiscovered. In an age where satellites can photograph every square meter of the Earth's surface, where we can sequence ancient DNA and peer into distant galaxies, the ocean depths remain one of the last frontiers. We've mapped the surface of Mars more completely than we've mapped our own seafloor. That blank space on the map is tantalizing. There's also something deeply appealing about the narrative of lost wisdom. The idea that an ancient civilization possessed knowledge we've forgotten resonates across cultures and eras. It suggests that progress is not linear, that we might not be as advanced as we think, that our ancestors might have understood things we've lost. This theme appears in myths around the world, from the Garden of Eden to the Golden Age described by Hesiod. For some, the Atlantis story also offers a way to connect with something larger than themselves. It becomes part of a worldview where hidden histories, secret knowledge, and suppressed truths explain why the world is the way it is. If archaeologists are hiding evidence of Atlantis, the thinking goes, what else might they be hiding? This brings us to something important. The belief in Atlantis has, at times, been connected to harmful ideologies. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, some writers used the Atlantis myth to promote ideas about racial hierarchies and cultural superiority. They argued that the Atlanteans were a master race, whose descendants brought civilization to other peoples who were supposedly incapable of developing it on their own. These ideas were incorporated into Nazi mythology and remain part of white supremacist belief systems today. Even when not overtly racist, the suggestion that ancient non-European civilizations couldn't have built their monuments without help from Atlanteans or aliens diminishes their real achievements. The Egyptians built the pyramids. The Maya built their temples. The people of Easter Island carved and moved their stone heads. They did it with ingenuity, organization, and hard work. Saying otherwise is not a harmless speculation. It's a denial of human capability and a distortion of history. Archaeologists today are working hard to counter these myths, not to spoil anyone's fun, but to preserve the integrity of the past and to honor the real accomplishments of real people. They're taking to social media, writing accessible articles, creating podcasts and videos to explain how archaeology actually works, what evidence we have, and why extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. The search for Atlantis also continues because it's profitable. Books about Atlantis sell. Documentaries attract viewers. Websites generate clicks. There's a whole industry built around ancient mysteries, and Atlantis sits at the center of it. This creates an incentive to keep the myth alive, to hint at new discoveries just over the horizon, to repackage the same speculations with new rhetoric. But perhaps most fundamentally, we keep looking for Atlantis because the story speaks to our anxieties. Plato's tale is, at its heart, about the fragility of civilization. It's about how even the most powerful societies can fall, how quickly fortune can turn, how hubris leads to destruction. These themes feel urgent in every age. Today, as we grapple with climate change, political instability, and technological disruption, the image of Atlantis sinking beneath the waves carries a particular resonance. We look for Atlantis because we want to understand our own vulnerability. We want to know if we're heading toward the same fate. And perhaps, in some corner of our minds, we want to believe that if Atlantis did exist and fall, maybe we can learn from its mistakes. Maybe we can avoid the same catastrophe. The uses of myth. Let's return, for a moment, to Plato's original purpose. He was not trying to record history. He was trying to teach. He was using a story to explore ideas about governance, morality, and human nature. And in that sense, whether Atlantis was real is beside the point. The Atlantis story works as philosophy. It presents two contrasting societies, virtuous Athens and corrupt Atlantis. It shows the consequences of moral decay. It warns against the dangers of imperial ambition and the worship of wealth and power. These are lessons that remain relevant, not because Atlantis was real, but because the patterns Plato identified, the ways societies can lose their way, continue to repeat. Throughout history, writers and thinkers have used Atlantis for their own purposes. Thomas More's Utopia, published in 1516, created an imaginary ideal society to critique the England of his day. Francis Bacon's New Atlantis, from 1627, envisioned a society dedicated to scientific advancement. These works weren't trying to find Plato's Atlantis. They were using the idea of a distant, imaginary place to explore political and social ideas. Myths serve important functions. They give us ways to talk about things that are hard to discuss directly. They let us imagine alternatives to our current way of life. They preserve cultural memory, though not always in literal form. And they remind us that the past is not a fixed, knowable thing, but something we construct and reconstruct generation after generation. The question isn't really whether Atlantis existed. The question is why we need it to have existed. What does the myth give us that history alone cannot? Maybe it's permission to dream. Maybe it's a sense of wonder in a world that sometimes feels too thoroughly explained. Maybe it's the comfort of thinking that if great civilizations have fallen before, our own struggles are part of a larger pattern, not a unique failure. Or maybe, at the deepest level, Atlantis gives us a language for talking about loss. Not just the loss of a place, but the loss of potential. The civilization that could have been. The knowledge we might have inherited. The paths not taken. Every culture has stories of golden ages and fallen paradises. Atlantis is simply the Western world's most famous version. The waters that tell no stories. The ocean keeps its secrets well. It is vast beyond our complete comprehension. Light penetrates only the shallowest layers. Pressure increases until it can crush submarines like aluminum cans. The deepest trenches remain largely unexplored, hostile to human presence. And yet, despite this vastness, despite these depths, the ocean is not infinite. We have sent probes to its darkest places. We have mapped its contours. We have studied its currents and its chemistry. We understand how sediment accumulates, how volcanic activity reshapes the seafloor, how tectonic plates collide and spread apart. The ocean could hide a shipwreck. It could hide a temple. It could even hide a city. But it cannot hide a continent. There is no lost Atlantis waiting beneath the waves. There are no crystal temples or advanced technologies preserved in the deep. The mud that Plato says made the waters impassable after Atlantis sank, that exists nowhere. And in a strange way, this is itself a kind of answer. The ocean's silence on Atlantis is not a mystery, it's a confirmation. The story was never meant to be solved by diving expeditions or sonar scans. It was meant to make us think. What we talk about when we talk about Atlantis. In the end, discussions about Atlantis are rarely about archaeology or geology. They're about what we value, what we fear, and how we make sense of change. When someone says they believe Atlantis was real, they might be expressing dissatisfaction with conventional narratives. They might be signaling openness to alternative ways of thinking. They might simply be enjoying the romantic appeal of the idea. When an archaeologist patiently explains why Atlantis couldn't have existed, they're not being closed-minded or defending a conspiracy. They're upholding standards of evidence. They're protecting the integrity of a discipline that has painstakingly reconstructed human history from fragments and traces. They're saying that truth matters, that facts matter, even when they're less exciting than myths. Both perspectives come from real human needs. The need for wonder and the need for rigor. The need to imagine and the need to verify. These needs don't have to conflict. We can appreciate Plato's story for what it is, a brilliant piece of philosophical fiction, without needing it to be literally true. We can enjoy speculation about ancient mysteries without requiring those mysteries to be real. The real history of humanity is extraordinary enough. The fact that our ancestors, with Stone Age tools and no written instructions, built Stonehenge and the pyramids and the megaliths of Malta, that's genuinely amazing. The fact that we can now extract DNA from bones tens of thousands of years old and reconstruct the migrations and relationships of ancient peoples, that's a kind of magic that would have astounded Plato himself. We don't need Atlantis to make the past interesting. The past is already full of wonders. The city that never was. Let's imagine for a moment what it would mean if someone did discover Atlantis. If tomorrow, headlines announced that sonar had located massive stone structures in the Atlantic, consistent with Plato's description. If archaeologists brought up artifacts that could only have come from an advanced Bronze Age civilization in exactly the place Plato said it would be, it would overturn much of what we understand about ancient history. It would require rewriting textbooks. It would raise profound questions about how the story survived, why no other ancient sources mentioned it, how we missed something so significant for so long. It would be one of the most important archaeological discoveries ever made. But it hasn't happened. And with every passing year, with every new advance in oceanography and marine archaeology, the possibility shrinks further. We are approaching the point where we can say with confidence, not just we haven't found Atlantis, but there is no Atlantis to find. This might disappoint some people, but there's a liberation in it too. It frees us from a futile search. It lets us appreciate the story for what it actually is, a philosophical parable about the dangers of hubris and the fragility of civilization. And it leaves us with questions that are perhaps more interesting than whether a specific island existed. Why do we need to believe in lost golden ages? What does it say about us that we're so drawn to stories of catastrophic collapse? How do our myths about the past shape our understanding of the present and our hopes for the future? These are the questions Plato would have wanted us to ask. Not, where is Atlantis? But what does the story mean? Not, can we find it? But what does it teach? The enduring mirror. Atlantis endures not despite being fictional, but because it is fictional. A real historical civilization would be limited by the facts of what it actually was. But a fictional one can be reshaped by each generation to reflect their own concerns and dreams. To the Renaissance, Atlantis was a symbol of lost classical wisdom, waiting to be recovered through scholarship. To the 19th century, it became evidence of diffusionism and racial theories. To the 20th century, it transformed into a repository of ancient supertechnology and spiritual knowledge. To the 21st, it's a cautionary tale about climate catastrophe and environmental collapse. The Atlantis myth is a mirror. What we see in it is ourselves. When we imagine Atlantis at its height, we're imagining our own civilization at its best, advanced, prosperous, harmonious. When we imagine its fall, we're confronting our own fears about what might happen to us. The sinking island is the future we want to avoid. The virtuous Athens that defeated it is the society we hope to be. Plato understood something profound about human psychology. He knew that abstract arguments about justice and virtue could be dry and unconvincing. But wrap those same ideas in a story about a magnificent civilization that fell because it lost its way, and suddenly people pay attention. They remember. They pass it down. The story wasn't meant to survive as history, but as philosophy, as a way of thinking about power and corruption and the fragility of what we build. It has survived brilliantly. It's still doing the work Plato intended 2,300 years later. The unfinished story. There's something else worth noting about Plato's Atlantis tale. The dialogue Critias, where the detailed description of Atlantis appears, is unfinished. It breaks off abruptly, mid-sentence, just as Zeus is gathering the gods to pass judgment on the corrupt Atlanteans. We never get to hear Zeus speak. We never get the full account of how Athens defeated Atlantis or how the island sank. The story stops right at its climax, leaving us hanging. Scholars have debated this for centuries. Some believe Plato simply never finished writing it, perhaps interrupted by his death or other projects. The dialogue would have been part of a trilogy, with a third dialogue called Hermocrates that was apparently never written or has been lost. Others suggest it was deliberate. Perhaps Plato meant the incompleteness as part of the message. By leaving the story unfinished, he forces his readers to become active participants. We have to imagine the ending ourselves. We have to think about what Zeus would say, what judgment would be passed, what lesson we're meant to draw. It's also possible Plato left it unfinished as a comment on the nature of history itself. The historical works he was responding to, particularly Thucydides' account of the Peloponnesian War, were also incomplete. Thucydides' history breaks off mid-sentence, just like Critias. By mirroring this structure, Plato might have been making a point about the impossibility of truly complete historical narratives, about the gaps and silences that always remain. Whatever the reason, the incompleteness adds to the mystery. If Plato had finished the story, tied up all the loose ends, explained everything, perhaps Atlantis would have lost some of its hold on our imagination. But the unfinished tale invites speculation. It leaves room for us to fill in the blanks with our own hopes and fears. What Atlantis tells us about ourselves. When we search for Atlantis, what are we really searching for? Some people are genuinely interested in archaeology and history, and that's admirable. The desire to understand the past, to piece together how our ancestors lived, is one of the noble impulses of human curiosity. But when that search focuses specifically on Atlantis, despite all the evidence suggesting it never existed, something else is often at play. We might be searching for validation. If Atlantis was real and possessed advanced knowledge, then our frustrations with modern problems, our sense that we've lost something important, gains a kind of legitimacy. We're not just dissatisfied with the present. We're mourning an actual, tangible loss. We might be searching for hope. If one civilization reached such heights, perhaps we can too. Or perhaps we already did, and we're capable of reaching those heights again. The Atlantis myth becomes a way of believing in human potential. We might be searching for meaning. In a universe that can sometimes feel random and indifferent, the idea that a great civilization fell because of moral failing, because the gods punished hubris, suggests there's a moral order. Actions have consequences. Justice, however delayed, is done. The universe cares about how we behave. We might be searching for wonder. In a world that science has demystified, where we can explain eclipses and earthquakes and where diseases come from, a lost continent beneath the waves represents something that still eludes us, something magical that might still exist in the margins of the known. We might be searching for identity. Different groups have claimed Atlantis as part of their heritage, seeing in it a validation of their own importance or a connection to something greater. If our ancestors were Atlanteans, then we inherit that greatness, that special status. Or we might simply be drawn to a good story. And Atlantis is a very good story. It has everything: rise and fall, hubris and nemesis, advanced technology, natural disaster, a civilization swallowed by the sea. It's dramatic, it's mysterious, and it's just plausible enough to fuel debate without being so plausible that it becomes mundane. None of these searches are inherently wrong. The human need for meaning, hope, wonder, and story is real and important. But they're better served by honest engagement with the world as it is, rather than by clinging to myths that contradict the evidence. The real past is extraordinary. The real story of human civilization, its genuine achievements and genuine failures, is more than sufficient to inspire awe. We don't need Atlantis to make history interesting. History is already interesting. The problem with pseudo-archaeology. The belief in Atlantis exists today primarily within what archaeologists call pseudo-archaeology, a term for approaches that present themselves as scientific or historical but don't follow scientific methods or engage honestly with evidence. Pseudo-archaeology isn't harmless speculation. It has real consequences. When popular books and television shows present Atlantis or ancient aliens or other fringe theories as equally valid to mainstream archaeology, they undermine public understanding of how knowledge is actually produced. They create the impression that all claims are equally legitimate, that professional expertise doesn't matter, that you can believe whatever feels right to you. This erosion of trust in expertise has spillover effects. If archaeologists are supposedly hiding the truth about Atlantis, why should we trust climate scientists about global warming? If historians are part of a conspiracy about the past, why should we trust doctors about vaccines? The logic is the same. Experts are either deceived or deceiving, and only those who think outside the box can see the real truth. This also does a disservice to the actual accomplishments of ancient peoples. When someone claims the pyramids couldn't have been built without help from Atlanteans or extraterrestrials, they're implying that the Egyptians weren't capable of building them. This is demonstrably false. We have extensive evidence of how the pyramids were built: the quarries where the stone was cut, the ramps used to move it, the workers' villages where the laborers lived, the accounting records that tracked food rations and tool supplies. By attributing human achievements to mythical lost civilizations, we rob real people of their credit. We diminish what they actually accomplished through ingenuity, organization, and labor. And often, particularly historically, these claims have been used to justify racist ideologies about which cultures are capable of advanced civilization. Modern archaeologists are working hard to counter these narratives, not out of closed-mindedness, but out of respect for evidence and for the actual people of the past. They're showing how indigenous peoples in the Americas built sophisticated societies without needing visitors from Atlantis. They're demonstrating how Pacific Islanders navigated vast ocean distances using traditional knowledge. They're revealing the complexity of African kingdoms that thrived without European intervention. This is the real adventure of archaeology, not finding Atlantis, but discovering the genuine, diverse, messy, brilliant reality of human history. The geography of impossibility. One more look at the geography will help us understand why Atlantis couldn't have existed where Plato said it did. The Atlantic ocean floor has been mapped extensively. Not every square meter, certainly, but enough that we understand its structure. The mid-Atlantic ridge runs down the center of the ocean like a spine. This is where tectonic plates are spreading apart, where new oceanic crust is being formed as magma wells up from the mantle. The ridge has mountains and valleys, volcanic peaks that occasionally break the surface as islands like Iceland and the Azores, but it's not a sunken continent. On either side of the ridge, the ocean floor slopes down into abyssal plains, vast flat expanses covered with sediment. These plains are deep, typically 4,000 to 6,000 meters below the surface. They're ancient, in geological terms, some of the oldest parts of the ocean floor. And they show no sign of recent catastrophic subsidence. The Azores, sometimes proposed as remnants of Atlantis, are volcanic islands sitting on the mid-Atlantic ridge. They've never been part of a larger landmass. They're the peaks of undersea volcanoes, rising where the spreading of the ridge has created particularly vigorous volcanic activity. Geological surveys confirm this. The rock is young, volcanic, not continental. Could Atlantis have been elsewhere? Some have suggested it was in the Mediterranean, which solves the geographic problem but contradicts Plato's clear statement that it was beyond the Pillars of Hercules, outside the Mediterranean. Others have placed it in Antarctica, requiring us to believe that Antarctica somehow moved from a temperate latitude to its current polar position in recorded human history, something plate tectonics tells us is impossible. Still others have suggested locations in the Caribbean, Indonesia, or even the North Sea. Each of these locations requires us to ignore or reinterpret parts of Plato's description. They require us to assume he was wrong about basic facts like where the island was or how large it was. At that point, we're not really looking for Plato's Atlantis anymore. We're just looking for any ancient civilization that suffered a catastrophe and then calling it Atlantis. This is a kind of confirmation bias. We decide Atlantis must have existed, then search for anything that might fit, bending the description as needed. Real historical and archaeological work goes the other way. We follow the evidence where it leads, even if it leads to conclusions we didn't expect or want. The evidence, when followed honestly, leads away from Atlantis. It leads to real civilizations like the Minoans, fascinating in their own right. It leads to genuine sunken settlements along coasts where sea levels rose. It leads to actual catastrophes like the Thera eruption that inspired stories and legends. But it doesn't lead to Plato's Atlantis, because that Atlantis was never meant to be found. The ocean in our minds. There's something haunting about the ocean that makes it the perfect setting for Atlantis. The sea is vast and deep and mostly unknown to us. It swallows things. Ships disappear into it. Coastlines erode and vanish. Islands emerge and submerge. The ocean is changeable, powerful, and opaque. We can't see what's beneath its surface without special equipment. Even today, with all our technology, the ocean maintains a sense of mystery. We've explored more of the surface of the moon than the depths of our own seas. The vast majority of the ocean floor has never been seen by human eyes directly. We map it with sonar, probe it with robots. But the experience of actually being there, of walking on the abyssal plains or exploring the trenches, remains impossible for humans without elaborate life support. This mysterious quality makes the ocean the natural home for lost civilizations in our imagination. If Atlantis is anywhere, surely it's down there, hidden in the dark water where we can't easily look. The difficulty of ocean exploration provides a perpetual excuse. We just haven't searched the right place yet. The technology isn't quite good enough. Maybe next year, maybe with the next expedition, we'll find it. But this is a feeling, not an argument. The difficulty of ocean exploration doesn't mean Atlantis is there. And in fact, the mapping we've done is more than sufficient to rule out a continent-sized landmass in the locations Plato describes. We don't need to explore every cubic meter of the ocean to know that an island larger than Libya and Asia Minor combined isn't there. Something that large would be obvious in topographic surveys. The ocean in our minds is deeper and more mysterious than the actual ocean. The actual ocean is governed by physics and geology. It follows understandable patterns. Its floor can be mapped, its history read in sediment cores, its secrets gradually revealed. The ocean in our minds, the mythic ocean, is bottomless. It can contain anything: sea monsters, lost cities, doorways to other worlds. This is the ocean where Atlantis exists, and it will continue to exist there no matter how thoroughly we explore the real one. The lessons of catastrophe. Set aside the question of whether Atlantis was real. Consider instead what the story tells us about the human experience of catastrophe. Civilizations do fall. Cities are destroyed. Empires collapse. This is historical fact, documented again and again throughout the archaeological and written record. The causes vary: disease, war, environmental change, economic collapse, social upheaval, but the pattern is consistent. What humans build, time eventually destroys. The sudden catastrophe, the civilization wiped out in a single event, has happened less often than gradual decline, but it has happened. Pompeii was buried in a day by Vesuvius. The Minoan settlements on Thera were obliterated by volcanic eruption. Coastal cities have been swallowed by tsunamis. Earthquakes have leveled urban centers. These real catastrophes leave traces, but they also leave gaps. Information is lost. The details blur. Stories are told and retold, each telling changing the narrative slightly, exaggerating some elements, forgetting others, adding new meaning. A local disaster can, over generations, become a cosmic event. A flooded town can become a sunken continent. This is how myths are born. Not from whole cloth, but from the distorted memory of real events filtered through human psychology, cultural values, and the inevitable game of telephone that is oral tradition. By the time Plato was writing, any real catastrophe that might have inspired elements of the Atlantis story would have been ancient history, its details lost, only the broad outlines remaining: a powerful place, hubris, divine punishment, destruction. Plato took these raw materials, if indeed he was drawing on any tradition at all, and shaped them into a philosophical argument. The details he provides, the circular canals, the elaborate palace, the specific measurements, these are likely his inventions, added to make the story vivid and concrete. But the emotional core, the fear of sudden collapse, the recognition that even the greatest civilization is vulnerable, that rings true because it is true. It's a truth humans have experienced repeatedly. When we tell the story of Atlantis today, we're continuing this tradition. We're taking our own fears of catastrophe, nuclear war, climate change, pandemic, economic collapse, social disintegration, and we're projecting them onto this ancient myth. Atlantis becomes a warning about what could happen to us. And maybe that's the real value of the myth. Not as history, not as a puzzle to be solved, but as a way of thinking about our own fragility. The story reminds us that what we've built can be lost, that arrogance and moral decay have consequences, that we shouldn't take our civilization for granted. These are lessons we can embrace without needing Atlantis to have been real. The warning is valid whether or not the specific example is historical. Living with uncertainty. One of the challenges of the Atlantis question is that it can't be conclusively, absolutely, 100% disproven in a way that will satisfy everyone. We can't search every square meter of every ocean. We can't excavate every coastline. There's always, somewhere, a tiny sliver of logical possibility that something unexpected might be found. This is a general problem in trying to prove a negative. You can't prove there are no unicorns. You can only note that despite extensive searching, none have been found, and that the evidence suggests horses couldn't evolve horns in that way. You can't prove there's no teapot orbiting the sun between Earth and Mars. You can only point out that there's no reason to think there is, and that space probes haven't detected one. Similarly, we can't prove with absolute certainty that nowhere in the Atlantic Ocean are there any ruins of any kind that might someday be interpreted as Atlantis. We can only note that geological surveys show no evidence of a sunken continent, that oceanography has found no large landmass where Plato said Atlantis was, that no artifacts or ruins matching his description have ever been discovered despite over a century of searching, and that the whole story fits the pattern of philosophical allegory that Plato used throughout his work. At some point, the absence of evidence, despite extensive looking, becomes evidence of absence. That point was reached long ago for Atlantis. But for those who want to believe, uncertainty is enough. As long as we haven't searched literally everywhere, the possibility remains, however remote. This is why scientific thinking requires not absolute certainty, which is rarely achievable, but reasonable confidence based on evidence. Based on the evidence, we can be confident Atlantis did not exist as Plato described it. Could we be wrong? In principle, yes. In practice, the likelihood is vanishingly small. We live with this kind of uncertainty all the time about much more important things. We can't be absolutely certain the sun will rise tomorrow, but we're confident enough to make plans. We can't prove with metaphysical certainty that other people have conscious experiences, but we treat them as if they do because the evidence overwhelmingly suggests it. We navigate life by making decisions based on probability and evidence, not absolute proof. The Atlantis question doesn't require certainty. It just requires us to look honestly at what the evidence shows and accept the most reasonable conclusion, even if it's less exciting than the alternative. Why it matters? Does any of this actually matter? If people want to believe in Atlantis, if they want to search for it or speculate about where it might be, does it harm anyone? In one sense, harmless speculation and imaginative play are part of being human. Reading a novel about Atlantis or watching a documentary that explores various theories can be enjoyable without causing harm. Not everything has to be literally true to have value. But in another sense, yes, it does matter. It matters when pseudo-archaeology masquerading as legitimate history makes it harder for people to understand how we actually know what we know about the past. It matters when conspiracy thinking about Atlantis feeds into broader patterns of mistrusting expertise. It matters when myths about lost advanced civilizations are used to diminish the real accomplishments of indigenous peoples. It also matters because our time and resources are finite. Every hour and every dollar spent searching for Atlantis is an hour and a dollar not spent on legitimate archaeology, on understanding the real civilizations that rose and fell, on learning from actual history. The obsession with finding mythical cities can overshadow the work of understanding the actual past in all its complexity. And perhaps most importantly, it matters because truth matters. We live in an age where the concept of truth itself seems under attack, where people increasingly retreat into echo chambers that confirm their existing beliefs, where the line between fact and fiction becomes deliberately blurred. The discipline of looking at evidence honestly, even when it contradicts what we want to believe, is crucial not just for archaeology but for functioning as a society. When we look at Atlantis honestly, we see that it's a story, a brilliant and enduring story, but a story nonetheless. Accepting that doesn't diminish it. It actually enhances our appreciation. We can admire Plato's genius in creating a philosophical parable that has captivated minds for over 2 millennia. We can explore the real historical events that might have influenced the tale. We can examine why the myth resonates so powerfully across cultures and eras. We can engage with Atlantis seriously without taking it literally. That's the mature, responsible way to handle myth. To recognize it for what it is, to appreciate what it teaches, and to not confuse it with history. The future of the myth. Atlantis will not go away. The story is too good, the imagery too powerful, the questions it raises too compelling. Each generation will rediscover it and reshape it to reflect their own concerns. In the coming decades, as climate change makes sea level rise a concrete reality for coastal cities around the world, Atlantis will likely take on new meaning as a warning about environmental catastrophe. The image of a great civilization swallowed by rising waters will feel less like ancient myth and more like possible future. As we develop better technology for ocean exploration, there will probably be new claims about finding Atlantis. Each advance in underwater mapping or deep-sea archaeology will be accompanied by speculation. Is this it? Have we finally found it? And each time, the answer will be no, but the question will continue to be asked. The myth will continue to appear in popular culture, movies, books, video games, television shows. It will be reimagined endlessly. Atlantis as high-tech superpower. Atlantis as spiritual paradise. Atlantis as cautionary tale. Atlantis as adventure setting. Each version will tell us something about the time and culture that produced it. And that's fine. That's what myths do. They persist because they're useful, because they give us ways to think about things that matter. Atlantis helps us think about the fragility of civilization, about hubris and consequences, about loss and memory, about the relationship between humans and the natural world. These are perennial concerns, so the myth will remain perennial. The key is to engage with it consciously. To know that we're dealing with myth, to understand where the myth came from and what it's doing, to appreciate its literary and philosophical value while not confusing it with historical fact. To let Atlantis be what Plato intended, a story that makes us think, not a place we need to find. The story we tell ourselves. In the end, Atlantis is a story we tell ourselves. It's a story about who we are, what we value, and what we fear. The specifics of the story change with each retelling, but the core remains. There was once a great civilization, it became corrupted, and it fell. This is, in many ways, the story of every civilization. Every society believes itself to be advanced, to have figured out the secrets of prosperity and order. Every society eventually discovers its limitations, faces its crises, and must adapt or decline. The details vary wildly, but the pattern is universal. by projecting this story onto a mythical Atlantis, we can examine it at a safe distance. We can think about the trajectory of civilizations without the painful immediacy of looking at our own vulnerabilities. Atlantis is a thought experiment, a way of asking, what happens when a society loses its way? What are the signs of decline? Can catastrophe be prevented, or is it inevitable? These are the questions that animate political philosophy, and they're the questions Plato was exploring. He wasn't trying to record history. He was trying to understand it. He was trying to figure out what makes societies succeed or fail, what virtues lead to flourishing, and what vices lead to collapse. The fact that we're still engaging with these questions 2,300 years later, still using the story he created to think through these issues, suggests he succeeded brilliantly. Not as a historian, but as a philosopher. Atlantis doesn't need to be real to be true. It's true in the way that myths are true, not factually, but meaningfully. It illuminates something about the human condition, about our capacity for both greatness and folly, about the impermanence of our works and the endurance of our ideas. The water settles. The ocean is calm tonight. The same ocean that, in Plato's story, closed over Atlantis. The same water that has swallowed countless ships, eroded countless coastlines, buried countless secrets in its sediment. But it has not swallowed Atlantis, because Atlantis was never there to swallow. It exists in a different ocean, the ocean of human imagination, where it will remain forever, unfound and unforgettable. And perhaps that's as it should be. Perhaps the value of Atlantis lies precisely in its absence, in the questions it raises rather than the answers it provides. A found Atlantis would be just another archaeological site. An absent Atlantis is an eternal mystery, a story that each generation can interpret anew. Plato gave us a gift when he wrote about Atlantis. Not a map to a lost continent, but a mirror for examining ourselves. Not a historical document, but a philosophical tool. Not a place to find, but a question to ponder. What happens when we lose sight of virtue? What happens when power corrupts? What happens when a civilization, any civilization, becomes arrogant and forgets that it too is subject to the forces that govern all human affairs? These are the real treasures buried in the Atlantis story. Not gold or advanced technology or ancient wisdom, but the simple, sobering recognition that nothing lasts forever, that empires fall, that the ocean is patient and the earth is indifferent, and that in the face of these truths, the most important thing we can do is try to build something good while we have the chance. The search for Atlantis can end. The questions it represents never will. And that's exactly as Plato, that brilliant, maddening, visionary philosopher, intended. The final thought. As we close tonight, I want to leave you with one more thing to consider. The beauty of myths is that they can be many things at once. Atlantis can be a warning about hubris and a celebration of human achievement. It can be a tragic tale and an inspiring vision. It can be Plato's philosophical argument and your own personal meditation on loss and impermanence. You don't have to choose between knowing that Atlantis is fiction and finding meaning in the story. These aren't contradictory. They're complementary. The fiction is how the meaning is conveyed. So when you hear someone talking about Atlantis, when you encounter a book or a show or an article about the search for this lost civilization, you now have the tools to think critically about what's being claimed. Is this legitimate archaeology following evidence, or is it speculation dressed up as science? Is it engaging with the story as myth, or demanding it be taken as history? And you can ask yourself what the attraction is. What is it about this particular myth that continues to fascinate? What does it tell you about the concerns of this moment, about the fears and hopes that shape our collective imagination. These questions matter more than whether there's a pile of rocks somewhere in the Atlantic that might, if you squint hard enough, look like ruins. The real investigation isn't geological or archaeological. It's psychological and philosophical. Why do we need to believe in lost golden ages? What does it mean that we keep looking for them? What are we really searching for when we search for Atlantis? Maybe we're searching for ourselves, for a reflection of who we want to be or who we fear we might become, for a story that makes sense of the rise and fall of civilizations, including, perhaps, our own. And in that sense, the search is worthwhile, even if the destination is imaginary. The journey makes us think. It makes us question. It makes us look at the past and the present with new eyes. Just don't mistake the map for the territory. Don't confuse the story with history. And don't spend your life looking for something that was never meant to be found. The real Atlantis, the one that matters, isn't beneath the waves. It's in the space between what we build and what we fear losing. It's in the gap between our aspirations and our failures. It's in every moment we choose virtue over expediency or fail to make that choice. It's in the recognition that our civilization, like all civilizations, is temporary, and that this recognition should make us humble, not despairing. This is what Plato wanted us to understand. And if we let Atlantis be what he intended, a philosophical parable rather than a geographical location, we might finally find what all those searchers have been looking for. Not a lost city, but a found truth about ourselves. Good night. Whether you're drifting off to sleep or simply sitting with these thoughts in the quiet of your evening, I hope you've found something worth contemplating. The story of Atlantis has been with us for over 2,000 years, and it will likely be with us for thousands more. Not because it's true in the way we usually mean, but because it's true in a deeper way, in the way that myths are true when they touch something essential in human experience. The search for Atlantis can end whenever we decide we've asked enough questions, learned enough lessons, and explored enough of what the myth has to teach us. But the questions themselves, those will remain. And maybe that's the real treasure submerged in these ancient waters, not precious metals or lost technology, but the eternal human questions about power and virtue, rise and fall, memory and forgetting. Thank you for spending this time exploring Atlantis with me. If you enjoyed this calm journey through one of history's most enduring mysteries, please consider liking this video and subscribing to Dreamy Hours for more quiet explorations of history, myth, and the stories we tell ourselves about the past. Until next time, rest well, think deeply, and remember that the most important discoveries are often the ones we make about ourselves.